The stagecoach rattled to a stop, and Margaret Hayes felt her heart thud in her chest, louder than the creaking wheels. She stepped down onto the dusty ground, her boots sinking slightly into the earth beneath her. The sun hung low in the Montana sky, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. Margaret paused for a moment to take in the vastness of the land before turning back to help her mother descend from the coach. Fabia, pale and fragile, took her daughter's arm, her silver hair shining like a halo in the late afternoon light. Her breathing was labored, and Margaret could feel the weight of her mother's illness pressing down on them both. Margaret's eyes found Ethan McAllister standing near the fence, watching them intently. The tall, broad-shouldered rancher was exactly as she had imagined from his letters, except, of course, for the one detail she had kept hidden. The silence between them stretched thin as Margaret's gaze flickered nervously from Ethan to Fabia. She had never mentioned her mother in her letters. It wasn't that she didn't love her, but she knew the truth would change things. Now, standing before the man she had promised to marry, the deception felt like a weight too heavy to bear. She could feel his eyes assessing Fabia's frail form, and the familiar guilt twisted in her stomach. Ethan walked slowly toward them, his boots kicking up dust with each step. His expression was unreadable, and Margaret's heart raced. Would he turn them away, back onto the stagecoach, and send them back to wherever they came from? Her breath caught in her throat as Fabia shifted her grip on Margaret's arm, an apology already forming on her lips. "I'm sorry, Mr. McAllister," Fabia said, her voice soft but dignified. "This wasn't what you expected." Before Margaret could say anything, she quickly added, "If you want us to leave, I understand. But please, let Mother rest tonight. The journey has been hard on her lungs." The air between them grew thick with tension, but Ethan simply stood there, his eyes flicking from Fabia's fragile figure to Margaret's anxious face. A long silence followed, thick with uncertainty. Margaret held her breath, unsure if this was the end of her brief journey toward new life. Then, unexpectedly, Ethan spoke, his voice calm yet firm. "My home has room for both," he said, his eyes softening as they settled on Margaret. She blinked, unable to process his words at first. The relief came slowly, washing over her like a flood. Her chest tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears sprang to her eyes. Ethan had said yes. He had said yes to her mother, too. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan gave a small nod, as though this were the most natural thing in the world. "But I need to know what she can and can't manage. This land is unforgiving. It's hard work, even in the best of health." He motioned toward the wagon. "I'll help her to the wagon. Let's get her inside so she can rest." Margaret's mind was still racing, trying to understand why Ethan had been so accepting, so kind. She had expected something far different, perhaps rejection, maybe even anger. But instead, there was only quiet understanding. As Ethan helped Fabia climb into the wagon, he glanced back at Margaret, his expression soft but practical. The back bedroom faces east. The morning sun should be good for her. Margaret blinked. He was already thinking of her mother's comfort, already planning for the woman who hadn't been mentioned in a single letter. The warmth in Ethan's voice made Margaret pause. What kind of man was he? Why was he being so understanding? Her thoughts were interrupted as Ethan returned to help her with the last of their things. Inside the cabin, the reality of their new life hit Margaret. The house was modest, but clean and well kept. There was no extravagant furniture, no elaborate decor, just simple, practical comforts. Ethan showed them to a small room at the back, where a clean quilt was already folded at the foot of the bed and a pitcher of water stood on the nightstand. Margaret glanced around. The room was quiet, peaceful, but it lacked the presence of a woman's touch. "I'll sleep in a barn until after the wedding," Ethan said, his ears reddening. He fidgeted with his hat, looking almost shy. Margaret paused for a moment, then helped Fabia sit on the bed. Her mother's exhaustion was palpable. Fabia smiled faintly, patting her daughter's hand. "That won't be necessary," Fabius said gently. "We can share, Margaret and I." Ethan looked relieved, his shoulders relaxing. "Well, that's good to know." He stepped out of the room, only to return a moment later with extra pillows. Proper feet up helps with swelling from the travel. Margaret's brow furrowed. He was too thoughtful, too careful for someone she had only just met. Who had he cared for in the past? Who had he looked after before? She helped her mother settle into the bed, her thoughts a swirl of confusion and gratitude. Ethan seemed to know exactly what to do, as though he had been a caretaker before. But why would a man like him, so strong and capable, be so willing to open his home to a stranger and her sick mother? Later that evening, Margaret insisted on preparing supper despite her own weariness. The meal was simple: beans, cornbread, and coffee. They ate in silence, with only the occasional quiet murmur as the evening wore on. But Ethan eventually broke the silence, his voice steady and calm. "My wife, Emma, died 3 years back," he said quietly. "Childbirth. Lost a baby too." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She didn't know what to say. But Ethan continued, almost as if he was speaking more to himself than anyone else. "My mother came to help after. Stayed 2 years before she passed last winter." Margaret's chest tightened, but she said nothing. She understood now. That's why Ethan knew how to care for the sick. He had done it before. The air between them shifted, becoming more personal. "I'm not looking for just a housekeeper," Ethan added softly. "I want family, a partner." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She searched his eyes, looking for any trace of deception. But there was nothing, only sincerity, only quiet strength. Fabia, who had been watching them both with quiet understanding, finally spoke up. "He's a good man," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of truth. "But you're still hiding something from him, aren't you?" Margaret's gaze dropped to the table, the weight of her secret pressing down on her. She didn't answer, but she knew her silence was all the answer Fabia needed. The sun rose the next morning, casting a warm golden light through the thin curtains. Margaret woke with a start, her eyes finding her mother lying beside her, still breathing heavily in the quiet room. Fabia's coughing had worsened during the night, and it was always worse in the early morning hours. Margaret rose softly, making sure not to disturb her mother, and quietly went to the kitchen. As she moved around the room, trying to make breakfast, she noticed something unexpected: warm milk with honey waiting for her outside the door. Ethan had left it there. The kindness was overwhelming, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt. She had come here, a woman running from her past, hiding the truth, and now this man was offering her things she didn't feel worthy of. She worked quickly to prepare a simple breakfast, but as she cracked eggs into the pan, she felt Ethan's presence behind her. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame. "You don't have to prove yourself on the first day," he said gently. "I'm just glad you're here." His voice was warm, without a hint of criticism. Margaret's heart swelled at the thought that he wasn't expecting perfection, just honesty, just presence. She felt the weight of her secret press on her again, and guilt twisted in her stomach. She wasn't being fully honest with him. She couldn't be. "I want to help," she replied, her voice tight. "You've been so generous to both of us." Ethan nodded and took a seat at the table, casually discussing what needed to be done around the ranch. "I'll need help with the books, mending the fences, getting the food preserved for the winter. But mostly, I need a partnership, someone I can rely on day after day." Margaret nodded quietly, but inside, the guilt gnawed at her. She had never planned on being in a partnership. She had planned to disappear into the safety of his home, taking care of her mother and keeping her secrets close. Yet, here she was, already part of something bigger than herself. After breakfast, Fabia joined them, looking stronger after a long night's rest. She sat at the table, and Ethan helped her settle in her chair, his respectful manner never wavering. As they ate, there was a quiet ease between the three of them, and Margaret found herself relaxing more than she had in years. The next few days passed with a rhythm Margaret wasn't used to days filled with work, laughter, and moments of quiet companionship. She helped Ethan with the ranch ledgers, finding that her education was useful in ways she hadn't expected. She had learned bookkeeping from her father, who owned a store before he died, but she didn't tell Ethan the full story. She kept the truth locked away. He asked her once where she had learned the trade, and she answered with a simple, "My father owned a store. Before he died." It was a half-truth. There is so much more to it, but Margaret wasn't ready to share that part of herself. In the evenings, Fabia spent time mending clothes or helping Margaret with small tasks. Her strength was slowly returning, and her presence in the home became the heartbeat of the house. Small moments of domestic bliss began to fill the days. Laughter over a spilled pot of beans, a quiet evening with the three of them reading together. Margaret found herself easing into this new life, despite the burden of her secret. One day, Ethan invited her to ride with him into town for supplies. As they passed through the streets, Margaret noticed the stares. She had been aware of the gossip in the town. The mail-order bride and her elderly mother had already become the topic of whispers. Mrs. Thornton, the shopkeeper's wife, couldn't help but comment. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order bride, Ethan. Didn't know they came with family attached." Margaret flushed, the shame of her deception rising in her chest. She had known this would happen, but now it felt worse than she had imagined. Ethan, however, stepped closer to her, his protective nature shining through. "You heard wrong," he said firmly. "I was blessed with two fine women." His words were a public claim, a subtle declaration that he stood by Margaret and her mother, no matter what the town thought. As they rode back to the ranch, Margaret felt the wall she had built around herself begin to crack. Ethan had defended her without hesitation, and something inside her softened. "Don't let small minds make you feel small," he told her quietly. His words resonated deep within her. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't invisible. She wasn't just a woman hiding from her past. She was someone worth standing up for. The days that followed were filled with small moments that made Margaret question everything she had believed about herself. Ethan was kind, patient, and unexpectedly tender in the way he interacted with both her and her mother. Yet, despite all of this, Margaret couldn't forget the letter that had arrived with the morning stagecoach just 2 weeks after she and Fabia had arrived. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Margaret Carver. When she saw the name, her heart nearly stopped. She had hoped to escape the past, to become someone new, but the past had found its way into her hands. Ethan was immediately concerned when he saw her face go pale. "Margaret, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. She crumpled the letter before she could think, her hands shaking. "It's nothing," she said quickly. "Just old correspondence." But Ethan had seen the name, Carver, not Hayes. That evening, he sat with her in the quiet of the cabin, his eyes searching hers. "Is there something you need to tell me?" His voice was gentle, but the weight of his words hung in the air between them. Margaret's stomach twisted. This was the moment she had feared. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I wasn't completely truthful in my letters," she admitted, her voice shaking slightly. Ethan was silent for a long moment, his gaze never leaving hers. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I was married before, to a man named Richard Carver." The words felt like a weight off her chest, but they also brought the fear of everything she had hidden coming to light. Ethan's expression didn't change. He didn't pull away, didn't seem angry. He just waited, patient, as if he knew there was more. "He was cruel," Margaret continued, her voice shaking with emotion. "He hurt me, and when my mother got sick, he refused to help her. So I left. I ran, and I didn't get a legal divorce. I used my maiden name to come here." She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry. I've deceived you." Ethan was quiet for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, he asked, "Is he looking for you?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper as she nodded. "I don't know. But if he finds me here, I brought danger to your door." Ethan's jaw tightened, but when he spoke, it was with quiet determination. "Then we'd better be ready." He didn't send her away. He didn't turn his back on her. He simply vowed to protect them both. The air had shifted in the days following Margaret's confession, but not in the way she had feared. Ethan had listened without judgment, offering only the quiet promise of protection. He hadn't asked for details of her past or demanded explanations. Instead, he'd given her the space she needed, his actions speaking louder than any words could. Margaret spent the next morning tending to Fabia, watching as her mother's health slowly improved under the gentleness of the ranch's peaceful routine. Ethan's presence was a constant comfort, and Margaret found herself growing more and more grateful for his quiet strength, even as she feared the day Richard would find him. She had known that her past would catch up with her eventually, but she hadn't expected to find peace. Not here, not with this man. As the days passed, the bond between Margaret and Ethan deepened. He never once mentioned the letter again, nor did he press her for more information about her life before the ranch. Yet, she felt it, the slow, steady development of trust between them. Ethan's quiet presence in the mornings, his gentle guidance as she learned the ins and outs of ranch life, and the way he treated her and Fabia with respect all began to erode the walls Margaret had built around her heart. Ethan wasn't just protecting them from Richard. He was protecting her from herself. As he helped her learn to ride, steadying her on the horse, his hands warm against her waist, Margaret felt an unexpected spark. It was a fleeting moment, one that left her heart racing, but she couldn't deny the attraction. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let anyone close, especially not a man. But Ethan wasn't just a man. He was something more. They spent more time together, working side by side. Ethan taught her how to mend fences and check the cattle, and Margaret showed him how to better organize the books and keep track of supplies. It was in the small things that their bond truly formed. The quiet moments spent over a shared meal, the laughter at the end of a long day, and the growing understanding between them. Yet, despite everything, there was still a part of Margaret that remained closed off. She couldn't let herself forget Richard. She couldn't afford to let her guard down completely, not when there was so much danger still lingering in the shadows. Ethan had made it clear that he was willing to protect her. But what if Richard showed up again? What if he hurt them all? The uncertainty hung heavy over her, and as much as she wanted to trust Ethan, she knew her past wasn't finished with her yet. It was only a matter of time before Richard would come looking for her. When they rode into town again, the tension between them was palpable. Margaret could sense the gossips watching them, but Ethan was unbothered. He was steady, unwavering, and once again, he stepped closer to her when Mrs. Thornton, the shopkeeper's wife, made a pointed remark. "Heard you're marrying her, Ethan," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping with judgment. "Didn't realize you were so desperate." Ethan's response was quiet but firm. "You're mistaken. I'm not desperate. I'm blessed." He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that Margaret couldn't help but feel a flicker of warmth in her chest. He had claimed her in front of the whole town, without hesitation or fear. As they rode back to the ranch, Margaret felt herself begin to relax. Ethan's words had erased some of her doubts. He didn't care about the town's gossip. He cared about her, and in that moment, that was all that mattered. But even as her heart began to soften, the letter remained in her mind, haunting her. When she returned to the cabin that evening, Margaret found herself holding the crumpled paper from the stagecoach. She had tried to forget about it, tried to bury the reminder of her past, but it was impossible. The name Carver burned in her mind, a constant reminder that she was running from something she couldn't escape. Ethan had noticed her distraction, but he hadn't asked about it again. She had told him part of the truth, but she wasn't ready to tell him everything. There was a fear deep inside her that if she told him all of it, he would leave. He would see her for what she truly was, broken, damaged, unworthy of his love. Yet, as she sat alone in the quiet of the cabin, She couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan already knew. He was patient, always waiting for her to come to him. But Margaret felt the weight of her secret pressing down on her. That night, as the fire flickered in the hearth, Ethan sat across from her, reading aloud as they worked on small tasks around the room. Margaret caught herself glancing at him, her gaze lingering longer than she intended. He wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature. There was a strength in him, but also a tenderness that she had never expected from a man who had seen so much hardship. As she listened to the sound of his voice, she found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't been in years. The attraction was undeniable, and though she tried to suppress it, she couldn't help but feel it deep in her bones. When he finished reading, Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them dared to voice. But in that moment, Margaret knew something had shifted. They were no longer just strangers bound by circumstance. They were becoming something more. It was in the way Ethan looked at her, the way his eyes softened when she spoke. It was in the way he always found time to help, to make sure she and her mother were safe. There was a trust between them now, one that wasn't built on promises or expectations, but on quiet understanding. Margaret realized, as they sat there together, that she was no longer afraid of what might come. With Ethan by her side, maybe, just maybe, she could begin to hope for a future she hadn't dared to imagine. But even as her heart opened, the shadow of Richard loomed over them. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time since she had arrived, Margaret allowed herself to believe that whatever came next, they would face it together. That night, as they said their good nights and Margaret lay in bed, she whispered a silent prayer. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. 3 days before the wedding, Margaret sat in her small room, hemming the dress she had chosen for the ceremony, a simple blue calico that Fabia had carefully picked out for her. The afternoon was peaceful, the golden light of late summer filtering through the window, casting a soft glow over the cabin. Margaret had allowed herself to enjoy the quiet, to imagine what the future might hold now that she was truly starting to feel like a part of this place, like she was finally home. But the peace shattered in an instant. She heard the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats, and her stomach clenched. She didn't need to see who it was to know. The unmistakable rhythm of the horse's hooves sent a cold shiver down her spine. It was him, Richard. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood abruptly, heart hammering in her chest. Fabia, who had been resting in the other room, quickly rose to her feet, her face instantly fraught with concern. Margaret's mind raced as she hurried to the door. She didn't want to let Richard see them unprepared, didn't want him to come between her and the life she had begun to build here. The worst part was that Ethan was in the barn, and she knew it would take him a moment to get back to the house. She was alone with her past, and that thought sent a spike of fear through her. The moment she saw Richard's silhouette on the horizon, Margaret's heart sank. He was dressed in fine clothes, his face cold and calculating, as if he hadn't just arrived from miles of rough travel. He was the same Richard she remembered, hard and unforgiving. Only now there was something darker in his eyes. He had come for her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. As he dismounted in front of the cabin, his cold, familiar gaze settled on her, a cruel smile curling at the corners of his lips. "There you are, wife," Richard said, his voice dripping with entitlement. Margaret's stomach churned as she fought the urge to step back, to run. But she didn't. She held her ground, her jaw clenched. Fabia, ever the protective mother, stepped forward, her hands shaking but her voice firm. "She's not going anywhere with you," Fabia said, her voice steady. Richard turned his gaze to Fabia, his expression darkening. "Oh, I think she is," he sneered, his hand hovering near his gun belt. "You've outlived your usefulness. She's my property, and I'm taking her back." Panic surged within Margaret, but she kept her voice calm. trying to keep control of the situation. "You don't have any say in this anymore, Richard," she said, her voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I left you because you hurt me. You've never cared for me or my mother. I won't go back to you." Richard's eyes narrowed, his hand moving dangerously toward the gun at his side. "You always were hysterical, Margaret," he spat. "Nothing but a liar." Margaret felt her legs tremble, but she stood taller, lifting her sleeve to show the scars that marred her skin, the scars she had hidden for years. "These say different," she said, her voice trembling but filled with quiet defiance. Richard's face turned a shade darker, but he didn't speak for a moment, his eyes narrowing with rage. Ethan arrived, just in time, stepping between Richard and Margaret, his body tense, ready for whatever might come next. His voice was low and calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. "I wouldn't, Richard," Ethan warned, his hand resting near the rifle slung over his shoulder. Richard sneered at Ethan, but didn't make a move. The standoff stretched on, the tension thick and suffocating. The ranch hand, Jed, appeared from the barn, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. The sight of Jed with his weapon made Richard hesitate, realizing he was outnumbered. The once confident man was now visibly unsettled. "This is legal business," Richard growled, his voice growing more desperate. "She's my wife. I have papers." Ethan stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Papers mean nothing if she doesn't want to go." Richard's eyes flicked to Margaret, daring her to admit that she was still his. "Tell him," he demanded, his voice rising. "Tell him you're legally mine." Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she lifted her chin, standing tall despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I left you because you beat me," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "I left because you were cruel. I don't belong to you anymore." Richard's eyes flared with fury as he stepped toward her, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll regret this, Margaret. You'll regret all of this." But before Margaret could respond, Ethan's voice rang out, calm but firm. "You have 10 seconds to get off my land, Richard." Richard's eyes locked with Ethan's, filled with venom. But there was something in Ethan's stance, in his unflinching gaze, that made Richard reconsider his next move. He paused, realizing that he was losing this battle. "This isn't over," Richard snarled, his gaze shifting back to Margaret with a cold, mocking look. "I'll be back with the sheriff." He turned on his heel, mounting his horse with a final, threatening glare at Ethan and Margaret. As Richard rode off, Ethan remained still, his eyes following Richard until the man disappeared into the distance. The tension in the air didn't dissipate immediately. Margaret felt the weight of what had just transpired, the danger that still lingered. She collapsed into Ethan's arms, shaking uncontrollably as the reality of it all hit her. "He's gone for now," Ethan said softly, holding her close. "But we need to prepare. We need to see the circuit judge. He's in town for 2 more days." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "What good will that do?" she whispered, doubt creeping into her voice. "He'll just come back with the sheriff." Ethan's expression hardened. "Out here, with evidence of abuse, you could get a divorce. And I'm not letting him anywhere near you again." Jed confirmed it, his voice steady and sure. "Saw it done last year. Woman showed her bruises. Judge granted divorce on the grounds of cruelty." Hope flickered in Margaret's eyes for the first time since Richard had arrived. "Then we go tomorrow," she said quietly, her resolve solidifying. But even as hope began to take root, the fear lingered. She could still feel Richard's eyes on her, could still hear his threats ringing in her ears. "But he might come back with the sheriff," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let him," Ethan said, his jaw set. "We'll be ahead of him legally. He won't win this time." Margaret felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly followed by fear. Richard wasn't going to give up easily. As the night wore on, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the dark, knowing that tomorrow would bring more challenges. But at least, for the first time, she wasn't facing them alone. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, But Margaret knew one thing for sure. Ethan would fight for her, and with him by her side, they might just have a chance. As she sat next to him on the porch later that night, he pulled her close, offering comfort and strength. "I'm sorry I brought this to you," Margaret whispered. Ethan kissed the top of her head, his voice warm and steady. "You didn't bring this to me. You brought yourself, and everything else is just noise." The wagon rattled into town at mid-morning. The usual bustle of the small Montana settlement, seemingly oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. Margaret sat in the back, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. Fabia, who had insisted on coming despite her frailty, sat beside her, her expression one of quiet determination. Ethan drove the wagon with his usual steady hand, his rifle resting in the seat beside him, a reminder that even in the peace they had begun to build, danger still loomed. The courthouse loomed ahead, its small, unassuming structure a sharp contrast to the storm of emotions swirling within Margaret. As they approached, the sheriff appeared in the distance, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. The moment Margaret saw him, she felt a cold dread settle over her, knowing that Richard's presence in town had already set the wheels in motion for what was to come. The sheriff walked toward them, his expression neutral but alert. "Ethan McAllister," he called, his voice carrying over the noise of the street. Ethan gave a curt nod, his gaze never leaving the sheriff. "That's me. We've got a complaint from Richard Carver," the sheriff said, his tone flat. "Claims you're harboring his wife unlawfully." Margaret's stomach twisted at the mention of Richard's name. She had hoped, at least for a moment, that the past might stay buried, that she might be able to start a new life with Ethan and Fabia without the threat of Richard's shadow looming over them. But it was clear now that the nightmare wasn't over. "That's so?" Ethan asked, his voice calm but laced with an underlying tension. "Margaret came here as my mail-order bride. A legal arrangement." The sheriff frowned, clearly skeptical. "She's already married McAllister. That makes it invalid." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Her heart raced as she listened to the sheriff's words, realizing that everything she had worked so hard to build could be taken away from her in an instant. "I'm seeking divorce on grounds of cruelty," Margaret said suddenly, her voice shaky but firm. She had kept her past hidden for so long, but now it was out in the open, and there was no turning back. The sheriff gave her a hard look, as if trying to gauge whether she was telling the truth. "That's a serious claim, ma'am," he said, his tone colder now. Before Margaret could respond, Richard appeared from the saloon, his usual smug smile plastered on his face. "See, there she is," he sneered, stepping forward. "Always making up stories. That's all she's good for. A liar and a manipulator." His words were like a slap, and Margaret felt the sting of them deep in her chest. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. Ethan, however, stepped forward, his voice quiet but filled with authority. "You're wrong, Richard," he said, his eyes cold. "This woman seeks divorce on the grounds of abuse, and I'll make sure she gets it." Richard's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, the circuit judge, a tall man with a weathered face, appeared in the doorway of the courthouse. "What's all this noise?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Your Honor," Ethan said, nodding in the judge's direction. "This woman seeks a divorce from Richard Carver, based on abuse she suffered at his hands." The judge looked from Ethan to Richard, his brow furrowing. "This is irregular," the judge said, his voice gruff. "Where's your proof?" The question hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She had never thought she would have to relive the worst parts of her life. She had hoped that coming here, she could leave all of that behind. But now, she was being forced to face it again, and the weight of it was nearly unbearable. With shaking hands, Margaret removed her shawl and rolled up her sleeve, revealing the scars that still marred her skin. There were gasps from the small crowd that had gathered, and Margaret's face flushed with shame. "He did this. And worse," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. "She's lying," he shouted, his voice rising in fury. "She's clumsy, always falling, always making excuses." But Fabia, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, her face pale but strong. "I'm her mother," Fabia said, her voice steady. "I witnessed it. He forbid her from seeing me for a year. When I fell ill, he refused to help her. She had to choose between caring for me and staying with him." Richard's face twisted with anger, but there was no denying the truth in Fabia's words. The judge's gaze turned sharp as he studied Richard, his expression hardening. "Do you have any witnesses to refute this?" the judge asked. Richard faltered, his gaze darting around the crowd. She's exaggerating," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge's eyes narrowed, his judgment clear. "Sheriff," he said, turning to the man beside him, "I'll hear this case in my chambers." Now, Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as the sheriff led them inside. The weight of the moment threatened to crush her, but she refused to show her fear. She had come this far, and she would see this through. The small courtroom was tense as the judge questioned her privately. Margaret's mind raced as she recounted everything. Everything Richard had done to her, the isolation, the cruelty, the fear. She showed him the scars, the physical evidence of the torment she had endured. She told him about the time she had been forced to choose between her husband and her sick mother, how Richard had refused to help. As she spoke, she felt the truth wash over her, giving her strength. The judge listened intently, his expression softening as she spoke. When he called in Fabia to corroborate her testimony, it was as though the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The judge studied them both for a long moment before calling in Richard. His story faltered almost immediately, contradicting himself with each word. When a judge finally called everyone back in the room, Margaret's heart was in her throat. Based on the evidence presented, physical scars, consistent testimony, and the defendant's failure to provide credible counter-evidence, the judge said, his voice steady, "I grant divorce on grounds of cruelty and abandonment." Margaret couldn't breathe for a moment, her vision blurring with tears. She had won. She was free. The judge's gavel came down with a final thud, and Margaret exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of the last few years lift off her shoulders. As the papers were signed, she felt Ethan's arm around her, steady and strong. She was free, and Richard, for all his threats and cruelty, had no hold over her anymore. When Richard stormed out of the courthouse, shouting his threats, Margaret didn't flinch. She was no longer his. She was free. As she looked at the legal papers in her hands, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. She had done it. She had finally broken free. And as she stepped out of the courthouse, the weight of the past fell away, leaving her with nothing but a future full of possibilities. "So, about that wedding tomorrow," Ethan said, his voice gentle but filled with hope. Margaret looked at him, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Yes," she said, her voice full of certainty. "Absolutely yes." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with the sun casting a warm golden hue over the ranch. Margaret woke early, the excitement of the day ahead bubbling within her, though she couldn't shake the lingering anxiety. She dressed carefully in the simple but elegant blue calico dress she had chosen for the occasion, and Fabia, with her ever-present quiet strength, helped her with the final touches, pinning wildflowers into her hair. Fabia's hands shook slightly as she worked, but her voice was steady and filled with love. "You look beautiful, daughter," she said, her eyes bright with tears. Margaret looked into the mirror, a woman transformed. A year ago, she had been running, broken and afraid, uncertain of what the future might hold. But now, standing there, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She wasn't running anymore. She was home. The wagon was ready, Ethan waiting for her outside, looking every bit the part of the groom in his Sunday best. There was no extravagance in his appearance, just simple, quiet dignity. He had been everything she needed and more: kind, patient, strong, and most of all, understanding. As Margaret walked toward him, the weight of the day ahead seemed to lift, replaced by something warmer, gentler: hope. Ethan greeted her with a quiet smile, his eyes filled with love and pride. "Ready?" he asked, his voice low but full of emotion. She nodded, her heart full of certainty. "I'm ready." The short trip to town passed in a blur of emotions, the small church coming into view as they approached. Margaret felt her chest tighten as they pulled up to the building, a simple structure that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 possibilities. Inside, there were a few neighbors, including Jed and some others who had been part of their lives since her arrival. The judge, who had helped them with the legal proceedings, was there to officiate the ceremony. It was modest, just like everything else in their lives, but to Margaret, it was everything she had ever dreamed of. The ceremony itself was simple but heartfelt. The judge's words were steady, and when he asked Ethan if he took Margaret to be his lawfully wedded wife, Ethan's voice was strong and clear as he replied, "I do." When it was her turn, Margaret hesitated, her throat tightening with emotion. "I do," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything she had experienced, everything she had overcome. And in that moment, with Ethan standing beside her, Margaret realized that she had found something more than safety. She had found love, acceptance, and a home. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but Ethan added something that made Margaret's heart swell. "I vow to honor your strength, respect your voice, protect your freedom, and love you and Fabia all my days," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. The words were more than just promises. They were a declaration of everything he had already shown her in the quiet moments of their lives together. Margaret's vow was simple, but it came from the deepest part of her heart. "I vow to trust you with my heart, build this life beside you, and love you with everything I am." The ceremony concluded with the judge pronouncing them husband and wife, and the crowd cheered. Margaret could hardly believe it was real. She was married. She was no longer hiding. She was finally free to be herself, to be loved and cared for in a way she never thought possible. As they walked down the aisle, Ethan took her hand in his grip warm and strong. The moment was theirs, and for the first time, Margaret allowed herself to feel the full weight of that truth. The reception was simple, but filled with joy. Neighbors brought food, and there was music, laughter, and dancing under the open sky. Margaret watched as Ethan shared a dance with Fabia, honoring her as the woman who had stood by them both through everything. It was a quiet, tender moment, and as Margaret watched, her heart overflowed with gratitude. This was the family she had longed for. This was the life she had fought for. She was no longer just a mail-order bride or a woman running from her past. She was a wife, a daughter, and a part of something much bigger than herself. As the evening wore on and the last of the guests left, Margaret and Ethan stood together outside the church, the night air cool and filled with the sounds of crickets. The stars twinkled above them, a reminder of how far they had come. They climbed into the wagon to head home, and Margaret could hardly contain her excitement. The future, once so uncertain, now stretched before them like a bright, welcoming horizon. When they arrived back at the ranch, the house felt different. It wasn't just a place to sleep anymore. It was their home. Margaret felt the weight of the years of running, the years of hiding, fall away as she stepped across the threshold, her hand still tightly grasping Ethan's. But as they entered the house, Ethan stopped and turned to her, his expression serious. "We should talk," he said quietly, the moment suddenly shifting. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, panic flickered in her chest. Was there something he needed to say? Had she missed something? But Ethan shook his head, as if reading her thoughts. "It's nothing bad," he reassured her, his voice soft. I want to make sure you know we're in this together every step of the way." Margaret's eyes softened, and she nodded, her throat tight. "I know, Ethan. I know." He smiled at her, the warmth in his eyes making her heart flutter. "Good, because no matter what happens, we're in this together." As they stood in the quiet of the cabin, Margaret felt the final pieces of her life fall into place. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't matter. She had found everything she had ever wanted right here with Ethan and Fabia. This was her family. This was her home. The world outside might still be full of challenges, but Margaret knew now that as long as they faced it together, they could overcome anything. With a deep breath, she turned to him, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I'm not afraid anymore, Ethan. Not with you." The tenderness in his eyes spoke volumes, and without a word, he leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. As they moved into their new life together, the worries of the past began to fade, and all that mattered was the promise they had made to one another of love, protection, and a future built on trust. 6 months had passed since Margaret and Ethan's wedding, and the ranch had transformed before their eyes. Spring had arrived in the Montana territory, bringing with it a new sense of life and possibility. The prairie that stretched out before the ranch was alive with wildflowers, and the garden that Fabia had carefully tended was lush with vegetables and blooms. The days were filled with hard work and laughter as the three of them, Ethan, Margaret, and Fabia, settled into their new routine. The ranch had become more than just a place to live. It had become their home, a place of refuge, warmth, and shared purpose. Margaret had found herself thriving in this new life, managing the books with the same precision and skill she had honed over the years, while also learning to care for the animals and help with the everyday tasks that made the ranch run smoothly. Ethan's support and unwavering belief in her had allowed her to blossom in ways she never thought possible. The woman who had once feared the future now walked beside him as an equal, a true partner in every sense of the word. Fabia, too, had found her place. Her health had improved with the fresh air and the peace that had settled over the ranch. The cough that had once plagued her was now rare, and her cheeks had regained their color. She was no longer the frail, fragile woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. She was vibrant and strong, the heart of their home. The love and care that Ethan and Margaret shared had infused the ranch with a sense of hope and renewal, and with every passing day, their small family grew closer. Their evenings were filled with laughter as they shared simple meals, telling stories of the past and dreaming of the future. The neighbors, once skeptical of the mail-order bride and her sickly mother, had now come to accept them. Mrs. Thornton, who had once been so quick to judge, had even apologized for her earlier gossip. "I didn't know what you were looking for," she had said one afternoon, "but I see now that it wasn't just a wife. You've built something beautiful here." The town had begun to embrace the McAllister family, and though there would always be whispers, Margaret no longer felt the weight of judgment on her shoulders. She had found her place. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Margaret sat on the porch, gazing out at the sweeping land that had become her world. Ethan came up behind her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. He had been working in the barn all afternoon, and his clothes were dusted with the grime of the day, but there was a contentment in his eyes that made Margaret's heart swell. As he sat down beside her, he looked out at the horizon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the prairie. "It's hard to believe how much has changed," he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Margaret nodded, a soft smile playing at her lips. "I never thought I could have this," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. "I thought I was just running away from everything. But now, it feels like I'm finally running towards something." Ethan's eyes softened as he turned to look at her, his hand brushing hers. "You're not running anymore, Margaret. You're home." The words, simple as they were, struck deep within her, and Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. She hadn't allowed herself to cry in months. Not since the day she had walked into Ethan's life. But now, she let the tears flow freely. The tears weren't born of sadness or fear, but of a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. She had found what she had been searching for all her life: family, love, a place to belong. And it was more than she had ever dared hope for. Later that evening, as the stars began to appear in the sky, Margaret found herself sitting beside Fabia, who was gently rocking in her chair, knitting a small blanket. The evening was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret allowed herself to savor it. It was the kind of peace she had never known before, the kind of peace that only comes when you have truly found your place in the world. Fabia glanced up from her work, a knowing smile on her lips. "You've come a long way, daughter," she said softly. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love for the woman who had been her constant support. "We all have," she replied, her voice full of gratitude. As they sat together, Margaret couldn't help but think back to the day she had arrived at the ranch, broken, fearful, and unsure of what the future held. She had been running, hiding from the truth, from herself. But now, she realized she wasn't running anymore. She was living fully and completely in a life she had built with her own hands, with Ethan by her side and Fabia's steady presence guiding them. Her heart felt full, and as she looked toward the future, she no longer saw the shadows of fear that had once haunted her. Instead, she saw the promise of a new life, one she could finally embrace. That night, as they sat by the fire in the cabin, the warmth of the flames wrapping around them like a comforting embrace, Margaret leaned her head on Ethan's shoulder. His arm came around her, pulling her close, and she felt a deep sense of belonging. "What do you think the future holds?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan kissed the top of her head, his voice steady and full of hope. "Whatever it holds," he said, "we'll face it together." Margaret smiled, the warmth of his words filling her heart. It was a promise, one that would carry them through whatever came next. A promise of love, of family, and of a future they would build together. And for the first time in her life, Margaret believed it. With Ethan by her side and Fabia beside them, there was nothing they couldn't face. The future was theirs, and it was filled with hope. And as Margaret watched the stars twinkle above, she knew one thing for sure. She was exactly where she was meant to be, at home.